at that time.
How many non-Jews were involved in Rutgers in protesting what was going on?
I would say that it was mostly Jewish students that actually testified at the hearings. There was a liberal league at Rutgers, and a lot of those students were protesting. But it was nowhere near the kind of climate that you had in Newark. In fact, most college campuses were nothing like like what you saw in the cities where there were large German populations, and then the response to it, large Jewish populations. But Rutgers was pretty quiet. Except for this incident, we probably wouldn't be talking about New Brunswick and Rutgers at all.
Was there any response in New Jersey to when we learned of the book burning? Any organized response, any library systems?
I don't think there was anything really right. It was certainly covered in the press, and it was one of the outrages that was covered, in the various protest marches and that type of thing. And you would see signs similar to the one there about, if you burn, the next thing you're going to do is burn people. How appropriate that was. I saw that in the exhibit here. If you burn books, you should be burning people, and they literally did that.
What year did Houghton go back to Germany?
The exact year was, I think, 1937. I'll confirm that for you. But it was in the later 30s. And was immediately given a position. He was known in Germany. His activities were known here too and supported. And he wasn't the only one. There were 3 other German professors, and 2 at least were pretty much. I would say that they didn't join the Nazi Party. They didn't join the Bund or the new German America and that organization. But for instance, as soon as Hauptmann got to Germany, he joined the party.
If a student were to follow this up, what, as an archivist, what archival material would be available for them? And for example, this fellow who then went to Queens, did he write letters or keep a diary, a memoir of what happened?
Yeah, it's funny because the case came up again. I didn't have time to discuss this, but on the 50th anniversary, you probably read in the newspapers that the university, President Blaustein, commissioned another group, and that's how the book was being Dave Oshinsky, Dan Moore, and Richard McCormick, the father of the current president, were part of a committee of historians to look into this, and their conclusions were challenged by another group. So we have the transcripts of the Action Day Committee. We have all the hearings and all the testimony in the archives. One can certainly look at that. One can look through the student newspaper, certainly covered it. The city newspaper certainly covered it. And I'm pleased to know that the New Brunswick Public Library is going to be getting a grant. I don't know if it's been announced yet, but soon we'll be getting a grant to digitize the home news from the microfilm. So all that will be available on your own computer at home. You can read through the proceedings of that. It's covered very well by the press.
But what about the principal, as I said? Were there letters, diaries, memoirs of the
Bergel himself. Bergel was very shy about it. He kind of fought he didn't really want the case to come up again 50 years later. He was vehement at first, and he did go to the FBI a number of times to try to convince them to go after Hauptmann. He, of course, was embittered by it, and he had to live with his in-laws for several years in Cranford, New Jersey, because he couldn't find a job. Clothier refused to write him a letter of recommendation, and neither did Dean Mader, and the Dean Douglas wouldn't write him a letter, and so it was only through real happenstance that Queens discovered him and gave him that position. If he kept any diaries or anything, we don't really know about it.
Yeah, there were several boot camps of sorts in Renton Township, in the NBFPL at Ridgetown. It was heavily Norwegian and showing me support in the neighborhood. They did appear there. I don't know how successful they were, but there were several years ago.
I've heard of them, but I don't think they really did much in the way of the real major ones were the one,
Right.
the one in Sussex County, the one in Andover Township.
This is right down the street.
Right, but they, they certainly had their followers everywhere. I mean, there were members of the voting that were right here in New Brunswick, much less vocal than in the cities that have big German populations.
The faculty stand on this whole dispute.
It was very mixed. Most of the faculty outside the German department were in Bergel's camp. And many of them testified during the hearings. But there were some that were very, many of them were just very apathetic about it and didn't take any stand. This Professor Hickman from the history department came back and said, there's a lot of propaganda in the American press. It's great out there. They probably paid for her sabbatical that she spent out there. But she spoke about, the trains running on time and all the stuff that you hear about. Everything's so nicely regimented, and it's the stuff about anti-Semitism was overstated by the American press. This was a Rutgers professor, a Douglas professor, outside the German department. So there were some that did, and there was one Jewish student that actually testified in Hauptmann's favor, saying that he always, was very collegial and all of that. So it was a very, it was mixed, but most of the faculty were certainly in Bergel's camp.
Very good work.
But not that, there were no big rallies and protests and that type of thing. It was all in the hearings.
Do you think Clothier stacked the committee?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, yeah. Remember, it wasn't a state university at that time. It was a private board of trustees, and he was accused of that a number of times, of having people that he knew would go a certain way.
Since you opened the subject, that still happens. That happens all the time. I don't know of a single committee that hasn't already pledged itself to the decision of the charge. Everyone.
Well, like I said, some things haven't changed a lot. I
Yeah.
think he was certainly, Hauptmann ran that department just as if, when I found out that he was a drill sergeant, it was just so apropos because he would bark out orders and, it was his way or the highway, basically. And the others fell in line very well. The other person who came at around the same time as Bergel, although Bergel was sort of last one in, first one out, when it came time to get rid of a position. But Emil Jordan was the other professor that was about his age and came in at the same time. And Jordan was given tenure.
Do you have any idea why the president of the Air Force was in support of Hauptmann?
I think, just supporting, why was he, why President Clothier might have supported Hauptmann in something like this. I guess, Hauptmann was his man. He was appointed to be chair. That's how chairs and deans, they were the lieutenants. And a lot of that still takes place too. It's very like whenever there's a grievance, it's pretty hard to win it, around there because of once a decision is made, you want to stand by your people. I'm sure he was in fact, there is material in the archives that shows that he changed his mind pretty quickly. He still felt like he had to rally the troops behind that decision, but he knew he had made a mistake in supporting Hauptmann so thoroughly and openly. But it wasn't that unusual for them to support unpopular decisions because they were made by chairs and deans that they had appointed.
Do you have any familiarity with the American Turners in New Brunswick? That was a German kind of a club, and they had a gymnastic component.
They had lots of clubs and societies.
They had some Bund activity there that they came in. The government came in and closed them down for a while.
Did they have open rally type?
Well, they had flags up and that sort of thing.
A lot of the German-American organizations did, especially at first. They had swastikas up because that really was the flag of the country. In 1933, that's what you flew, no matter what you thought if you were in a German club. That didn't last very long, partly through German intervention, partly through the members finding out what was really happening there.
Any other questions? Maybe one or two more? I'm just curious, how did it affect Rutgers' decision-making and departmental activities long-term? Did it affect it?
Well, it's hard to say, but hopefully it affected it possibly a little bit for the better because it was a huge embarrassment. The university had to really the press just excoriated Rutgers as time went on, even 50 years later, especially 50 years later, because hindsight, of course, makes things look a lot clearer. They didn't look very good, and they probably were more careful. They certainly, the person that they hired ultimately, and this was probably after Hauptmann left, I think Bergel's replacement was hired after he, in fact, he didn't just leave he didn't just leave letting them know he was going to leave. He had asked for a leave of absence, it was denied, and then he disappeared. In November, right in the middle of the semester, he just literally packed up and headed for San Francisco to get the boat to get out of here. So it was just a terrible stain on the university's reputation that they would back somebody like this.
Well, it seems to me that one of the issues that would have gone into, or that was apparent from this, is that there was a political disconnect. But it seems to me that the university now would not consider political, religious, those kinds of situations. Is that a change because of that kind of incident, or is it just our society changing?
Well, a little bit of both, but really, when you think of how things have occurred, right after this period, after World War II, you have an explosion of Jewish students, to the point where Rutgers now, I think, has something like the third or fourth largest percentage of Jewish students for a public university, a state university in the whole country. And you see all the institutions and what have you. Whether that affair had something to do with it, like the embarrassment of that, or whether it was just demographics, and a liberalization of university policy, it's really hard to tell. But like I say, there was a real stain on the university, and I would think that today there was a debate of whether there should be politics in the classroom. That certainly, and both sides, Bergel and Hauptmann, were accused of that. Hauptmann would come in and constantly, give the news of the glorious things that were happening, and Bergel would go into his classes and tell people about the horrors that were happening and how Germany was being dispersed by this new regime.
Last question.
Well, I guess tangentially, I know Hauptmann is a very common name, German name, but is there any chance that he might have been related to Hauptmann from Lindbergh?
I'm going to ask very quickly, in response to the issue of politics, was there a more recent, like the Genovese case in the 50s or 60s, anti-communist?
Right, that was right, yeah. And Rutgers was embarrassed pretty thoroughly by that as well.
It was not ancient.
Yeah, that's for sure.
It's always positive.
Yeah,
it's always positive.
Right. And professors these days are protected by tenure and what have you, and they are allowed to profess all sorts of beliefs. The ACLU, by the way, became involved in this too. They defended Bergel because he was being persecuted essentially, possibly for that reason. But again, the university ultimately concluded that it wasn't that reason. That it was apparently Emil Jordan had a couple more journal articles that he published. He was much more active in the German club, and he went into the German house and had meals with them. Bergel, by the way, was not invited to do this, and then was condemned later on for not doing it. So the ACLU did become involved in one of their early cases. But again, nothing really came of it. Bergel had to leave, and things quieted down in a hurry. Until the war itself started. And then, of course, there was a tremendous Rutgers positive involvement in World War II, very well documented by the oral histories that we've done, several hundred of them, of Rutgers people who were involved in World War II. And that's all on the internet, along with the transcripts of every interview. And they would be, most of the soldiers that fought in World War II would be too young to have remembered the Hauptmann-Bergel affair, because they would have been graduates from the late 30s. But one could do a word search. In fact, I think I'm going to do that now. I'm going to go into it has its own search site, the Rutgers World War II Oral History site, and just throw in Bergel's name and Hauptmann's name to see if any of them have that on their mind.